Hey, thanks for joining me. Hope you're doing well. Atlantis is known as an advanced civilization that existed in the distant past. Plato described Atlantis in detail in the Critias and the Timaeus. In Plato's accounts, the Greek god Poseidon reigned over Atlantis. It's said that the Sumerian god Enki intervened in the evolution of humanity and created an advanced civilization that was destroyed. Enki then helped in renewing civilization. Enki is the equivalent of Satan. Enlil, a different entity, created Eden, what we now call the Garden of Eden. And Enki was who we now call the serpent. Enki is often depicted with a serpent surrounding him. Enki is where we get the word Loki from, who was a horned god and the Norse equivalent of Satan. So somewhere in mythology, Enki's title changed to Ea, which translates to house in water or dwells in water. Enki thus became Ea, the lord of the seas. Poseidon and Enki are the same being, just in separate mythologies. Some scholars associate Enki or Ea with Neptune, and the Roman equivalent of Poseidon is Neptune. So Poseidon or Enki, whatever you want to call the entity, reigned over Atlantis according to Plato. The horns were a symbol of wisdom, but also of rulership. This is why shamans, priests, and kings adopted the convention of wearing horns, which we now call crowns. This was to indicate that they were descendants of the Atlanteans who were endowed with power. Enki has horns, Loki has horns, Poseidon has a crown, and as you can see, Poseidon has a pitchfork and a tail. Over time, this was converted into the Christian Satan. Just wanted to clear up that they are the same entity. Plato says, I have before remarked in speaking of the allotments of the gods, that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent, and made for themselves temples and instituted sacrifices. And Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begat children by a mortal woman. Atlantis was said to be destroyed by a flood. We won't really explore that topic in this video, but I'll say the city of Enoch was also destroyed by a flood. They're the same city. In the book of Enoch, it talks about watchers corrupting mankind. And the angels, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. And they said to one another, Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the children of men, and let us beget for ourselves children. With both of these texts, we can piece together a rough history. Those posing as our divine rulers had their genes somehow intertwined with our own, maybe through intercourse, maybe through direct genetic manipulation, and this was the beginning of the entire imprisoning matrix we're currently living in. When Plato says the gods made for themselves temples and instituted sacrifices, this tells me that this was the first time worship became a thing. The gods made for themselves temples. We had nothing to do with it. We were probably deceived into the pattern of worship. Sacrifice became instituted. As we know, worshiping anything other than our own divine energy and the energy around us is satanic. And once we obfuscate our divine energy towards other entities, fucked up things start to happen. Frederick Oliver wrote in the book A Dweller on Two Planets, an account of Atlantis. Human sacrifices became common. Lust, gluttony, and drunkenness ran riot, and the moral night's deep darkness closed in yet more blackly. Think of Plato's account. Human sacrifice, our blood, which is magical, started powering evil acts, and slowly but surely we became something we weren't. Plato wrote, They despised everything but virtue, caring little for their present state of life and thinking lightly of the possession of gold and other property, which seemed only a burden to them. Neither were they intoxicated by luxury, nor did wealth deprive them of their self-control. But they were sober, and saw clearly that all these goods are increased by virtue and friendship with one another, whereas by too great regard and respect for them, they are lost and friendship with them. By such reflections and by the continuance in them of a divine nature, the qualities which we have described grew and increased among them. But when the divine portion began to fade and became diluted too often and too much with the mortal admixture, and the human nature got the upper hand, they then became unable to bear this fortune. Currently, we're trapped in an unnatural cycle of reincarnation and rebirth, and this is due to the fact that our souls have been hijacked, taken to a place that isn't where we should be. We, as divine souls, were somehow lured from the underbelly of our earth, the land of perpetual twilight, and into Atlantis and Lemuria, which is a place I won't get into in this video. Or we were simply curious. There's really no way to know. So originally, the material possessions of Atlantis had no power over us. Those who told us they were our gods tried to lure us into the trap of materiality. And over time, it worked, and we started forgetting who we are. Those posing themselves as our divine rulers were actually reptilian beings influenced by the archons. At first, we as reptilian hybrids retained a certain holiness of the mind and heart. But over time, this divine element became weakened and our reptilian traits became dominant. Power and greed among us were born. I want to quickly mention that it's a common idea that humans are naturally greedy. What I'm saying is we were lured to the side of the flat plane and over time were coaxed into this pattern, and with our reptilian genes, this made it even worse. In the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean, it's clear that beings crept into this place and began to take over. In the form of man they amongst us, but only to sight were they as our men, serpent-headed when the glamour was lifted, but appearing to man as men among men. Crept they into the councils, taking form that were like unto men, slaying by their arts the chiefs of the kingdoms, taking their form and ruling over man. This is obviously talking about reptilian shapeshifters. After this reptilian-made hybridized race achieved a high degree of civilization, it began to degenerate because of a dilution of divine essence. Again, Enki or Poseidon is said to have created this advanced civilization that was destroyed, and then assisted in renewing civilization. We were tricked with reptilian genes, worship of gods, and materiality, and this paved the way so future generations could now be controlled by those who set themselves up as our rulers. The Atlantis cross is an emblem used by several esoteric groups throughout history. The cross's design is based on Plato's description of the Atlantean capital city. In the innermost ring of the capital of Atlantis was a sacred mountain where the original race of Atlantis is said to arose. We know that Mount Meru is at the center of our plane and is considered a sacred mountain. Atlantis was situated here. So the original race came from the sacred mountain. This tells me on the other side we somehow entered a vortex and popped up through it. Plato himself said Atlantis was encased in 3 concentric rings of land divided by water. The symbol shows this, and so do many depictions of Mount Meru. The Atlantis symbol consists of a cross within a circle embedded. In the book The Magdalene Legacy, a cross within a circle is called a Rosicrucis, and is the original symbol for the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is the chalice Jesus drank from during the Last Supper. Jesus is an allegory for the movement of our sun. The Last Supper occurs during the winter solstice. The sun moves into the center hole briefly during the solstice and, quote, drinks from the Holy Grail. Grail comes from the word craterus, which in Latin means crater. So the Holy Grail isn't merely an object, but a crater that when we enter through, we achieve everlasting life and abundant happiness. Back to the symbol. The concentric rings represent a vortex. The rings are a 2-dimensional expression of a 3-dimensional experience, that of traveling through a stargate. So the Atlantean symbol might not only mean concentric rings of land, but an actual stargate into another reality. As mentioned, the symbol of Atlantis is derived from the description of the enclosure constructed by the gods to protect the original sacred hill of Atlantis. Plato says the gods built this enclosure to keep humans out. We could draw parallels to the Garden of Eden. A flaming sword was placed at the gate and turned every which way to guard the way to the Tree of Life. As I explored in my last video, the Tree of Life is the same thing as Mount Meru at the center of our plane. Mountains are giant tree stumps, so the Tree of Life was cut down and is now Mount Meru. This is an Asian depiction of Mount Meru. You see the concentric rings. This one shows an hourglass and is strikingly similar to what NASA tells us a wormhole looks like, suggesting what I'm saying. Mount Meru is a gateway to another world. Some say Mount Meru was the model for the Tower of Babel. The tower is usually made out in a spiral shape, kind of strange for a tower. And the Lord said, "Indeed the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. This tells me that one of the final ways of corrupting this once pure population was by getting rid of telepathy, the one language we all had. Nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them, because telepathy doesn't lie. Language was invented, spellcasting or spelling began being taught to everyone, and fast forward to now, most of us have no idea that we even have telepathic abilities. The Tower of Babel could mean that everyone was working together in harmony because of our one language, our telepathic powers, and this was against the plan of our reptilian slave masters. The Sumerians depicted this Stargate as an 8-pointed star. The Dharma wheel has 8 lines emanating from it as well, and is said to represent nirvana. We achieve nirvana when we exit this matrix through the vortex at the center. I can't pinpoint where this one comes from, so I'd love some input, but need I say more? This is a 2nd century Chinese drawing of Mount Meru. Now look at this diagram of a cyclotron, a type of particle accelerator. They look very similar. In the art of Tantra, we see a drawing titled Rose Apple Land. Perhaps these lines are natural force fields that are protecting Mount Meru. And perhaps our particle accelerators were made in mind with the natural one by Mount Meru. Most of these things we won't know until we actually take the voyage and see for ourselves. At the center of our plane is the way out of this matrix. Below us is the destination, the land of perpetual twilight, powered by the black sun, where we will no longer be encased in a world full of deception and confining constructs. Check out my other videos for more info. Thanks for watching, guys. I love you all.